But welcome, afternoon everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Welcome to the LSE, and apology from my co-chair Donald Kaberuka, former Finance Minister of Rwanda, who can't be here today. So I'll be in the chair with my two academic co-chairs, Paul Collier and Tim Besley, who you probably all know. Just by way of introduction, welcome to the Commission on State Fragility, Growth and Development, commonly known as Fragile State Commission. Why are we doing this? Well, 50% of the world's poorest people soon will be living in fragile states. Obviously, India and China's growth is taking tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And while, of course, the traditional aid programs and disease prevention programs and other programs are going to be fantastically important, it's our view that increasingly we're going to need to focus on the most fragile states in the world and how we help them, because otherwise lots of people are going to be condemned to perpetual poverty. And also, if we look at some of the problems that the world is facing, whether it's pandemic diseases, whether it's climate change, whether it is conflict, mass migration, terrorism, many of these problems are at their worst in the most fragile countries and at the most difficult to deal with and help to solve. And so that's why this commission was set up by London School of Economics and Oxford and the International Growth Centre, and they very kindly let me gatecrash and come and join in with the work. What we've done is we've broken it down into 5 elements. How do we help build the legitimacy of countries and governments that are racked by conflict and fragility? How do we help governments and countries have a greater capacity, be more effective? How do we deal with conflict and try to have, because many of these countries have perpetual conflicts, how do we put in place lasting peace and reconciliation processes? How do we encourage private sector development? Most fragile states have extremely weak private sectors, virtually non-existent SME sectors, and that we think is fantastically important. And fifth, how do we try to help these countries be more resilient? Many of them became fragile because of the shocks they've been hit by, or in some cases are perpetually hit by, and how do we help encourage resilience, both preventing against shocks and then being able to mitigate them and deal with them when they happen. We've had an evidence session on each of those areas, so we're quite well through our work, but a massive gap we thought we had as we went through these sessions and had a lot of academic presentations as well as people from governments and NGOs and others, is in the whole area of I suppose what you call dev tech, technology that's being used to try and accelerate development and help countries make leaps forward economically, and often technology that can be used to help with transparency or governance or fighting corruption, enhancing the institutions in these countries. And we also haven't heard from all of the most important NGOs, and we're going to be starting with Owen Barder from the Centre for Global Development. We're going to be hearing from Jamie Drummond from One. So this is a good opportunity, I think, to bring together a group of people, to hear from you, and to enable the two academic co-chairs and me to ask some questions to try and help inform our thinking. We've got to produce a report sometime early next year, and our aim is to try and, you know, it sounds rather grand, but to sort of write the new rule book for aid and development. A passionate supporter of 0.7, very proud to have delivered it as Prime Minister in the United Kingdom, the only G7 country that's kept its promise on that, just like to make that point. But I'm very conscious of the fact that we can't just go on making all the old arguments for aid, vital though they are. We also need to make new arguments which do concern security and global worries and concerns that people have in our modern world. And we hope that we can try and both support the movement for aid and development, but focus it on how do we help these most fragile states? What are the interventions or non-interventions that would make a difference? And so that's why we're all here today. Thank you very much. We'll try and run this session for less than 2 hours. I think the way we're going to do it is we're going to hear from everybody in turn, starting with Owen. If you could say something about yourselves and your organisation, and then really what you think from what you've learned from what you do about how we can help fragile states. That's the subject under discussion, and then we'll ask you a series of probably pretty dim questions to try and draw out the arguments and learn what we can. Everyone happy with the process? We'll go straight ahead and hear from Owen first, and then after him we're going to hear from Alex, and then after Alex we're going to hear from I'm so blind now, I have to do this. We're going to hear from Matt, and then we're going to hear from Jamie Drummond, and then I'll keep updating you. And it's sort of, I think you're getting a little bit longer because you've been at this subject for such a long time, but then it's going to be sort of 5 minutes each. And if we try and stick to that, I'll try and police it. Owen, over to you.
That's made me feel very old. I work at the Centre for Global Development, which is an independent think tank with offices in Washington, London, and now Brussels. And I'm the Europe director. But before that, I was a civil servant and worked in the Treasury, in Number 10, and in DFID, including for many years on various ICT and development-related topics. And just using a microphone. That's good. What I'm going to say in 10 minutes to try and frame this discussion can be summarised by something known as Amara's law. And some of you will know what Amara's law is, and those of you who don't will know by the end of my 10 minutes what it is. So I'm going to say something about where I think we've got to so far, about which I'm going to be kind of E-or, for those of you who know your Winnie the Pooh, and something about where I think this might go in the future, about which I'm going to be a bit more Tigger. And then I'm going to give you 5 policy suggestions for what it all means. I'm taking this to be about digital and information technology. There's a whole set of questions about what development economists have called technology more broadly, things like germ theory, vaccines, agricultural technologies, and so on, all of which are extremely important, and there's a lot more that we could do to increase R&D, both the diffusion and the uptake, as well as the development of those technologies. Things like use of genetic modification in agriculture. I'm not going to talk about that, although I think there is a big and important policy agenda. I'm going to focus on that bit that's to do with the internet, communications, big data, geolocation, those kinds of issues, the kind of that part of the DevTech world. So what have we learned so far? This is the E-all part. Well, we've been promised, I think, that these technologies could make a huge difference. E-medicine was going to enable surgeons around the world to help surgery in developing countries. E-learning was going to substitute for a lack of qualified teachers or textbooks. E-government was going to get rid of corruption or improve public services, improve their efficiency and take-up. E-accountability was going to enable citizens to hold their governments to account. FinTech of various kinds would facilitate money transfers and payments, give people access to financial services that they haven't had before. Blockchain would give us secure distributed ledgers to record transactions and assets. Electronic price information would give people access to markets and stop them from being gouged by middlemen and so on. Now, some of those things have, to some extent, come to pass, but I think it's pretty clear here in 2017 that they haven't lived up to the promise of real transformation that they might bring. And I'm going to give you 2 reasons why. The first is that many of these things have taken the form of automating and improving and making more efficient existing processes. So it's a good idea to computerize your port, your customs organization, or your school management system, or your payroll. And we've been doing those things for decades, computerizing government services. But they're all essentially taking existing services and trying to make them a little bit faster, a little bit better. And there have been some improvements from that. My colleague Jenny Aker did a study, a randomized controlled trial of giving farmers mobile phones in rural Niger. And it enabled them to know more about wholesale prices in the market. It reduced the cost of price search by around 50% for them, which is not trivial, although those costs weren't very high for them. It reduced price volatility for them by around 12%, increased their overall income by somewhere between 10 and 30%, $150 a year. So not negligible, but not transformational. These are marginal improvements making these processes work better, and we can look at lots of examples where you get some improvement, but nothing that really changes things fundamentally. The other reason why I think these technologies haven't been transformational so far It is more to do with the political economy of development. And I saw this firsthand. We don't normally talk about our failures in development because we're worried about the Daily Mail cottoning onto it. But I'm going to talk about a failure that I was involved in. I was on the advisory group of an NGO in East Africa. And we had a program called Daraja. And the idea of Daraja was that many people in Tanzania, their water points, about half the water points in Tanzania don't work at any one time. And the idea was that people would be able to report with either a smartphone or a mobile phone, send in a text message and say, my phone isn't working. And we would gather all this data, we'd geolocate all the water points, and we'd produce league tables and do press releases and get questions asked in Parliament. And this would drive up the performance of the water points and everybody. It was, it sounded like a good idea. I spent some time going around telling people how marvellous it was going to be. And it didn't work, and it didn't work because people didn't report that their water point was broken, and we tried to find out whether it was too expensive, and we made it free, and that didn't. We tried to make sure people knew about it, and eventually it turned out people did know about it. And so we asked them, which we should have done earlier on, why it was they weren't using it. And the answer was that they didn't think that anything would change. So it wasn't worth even the 30 seconds it would take them to send a free text message on a phone they had, because they knew, or they thought they knew, that the reason why these water points weren't working was because they were marginalised people without a voice, and it wasn't part of the political system's priority to make their water points work. And so using tech to provide information about which water points weren't working didn't actually solve the problem that was constraining it. Later on, more recently, I chaired a high-level panel on the use of cash transfers for refugees and in humanitarian situations. And there the evidence is absolutely overwhelming that if you use cash, preferably in the form of digitized electronic payments mechanisms like mobile money or cards, you can massively reduce the cost of helping refugees and people affected by humanitarian problems. You can get a 30 or 50% increase in what they can buy. They get real agency and choice about what they need. You can track who spends what where. You can use biometrics to link the payments to individuals, so you've got much less opportunity for corruption and theft. Local communities prefer that because it helps the local economy, local producers, local suppliers benefit. It's good for everybody except the World Food Programme. The World Food Programme is in the logistics business. They're in the business of shipping food around the world. And giving people cash is in no way in their interest. And the UN system has systematically blocked the uptake of cash, even though the evidence is so overwhelming. So we now have less than 1/20 of humanitarian aid is provided by cash transfers. Not because the technology doesn't work, the technology works fine. Not because we don't know that it would work, we know that it would work, it's been proven time and time again. But because the incumbents in the current system don't want it. And if you ask yourself, just finally on an example of why things don't work, if you ask yourself why M-Pesa, which has been a huge success in Kenya, hasn't happened anywhere else, at least not at that kind of scale. Well, in most cases, because existing banks have connived with the regulators to keep it out of those markets. So yes, the technology is there, but powerful elites and incumbents benefit from the status quo and don't want to see these change happen. And the answer to that is not better technology or more technology, right? The answer to that is addressing the thing that's causing the underdevelopment in the first place, which is that the existing elites, existing incumbents benefit from the status quo. And technology really does nothing to shift that. So that's why I'm Eeyore-ish about where we've got to so far. Not that it's been bad, but that it hasn't really changed things in the way we hoped it might. But I'm more Tigger-ish about the future, you'll be pleased to hear, right? I'm always invited to meetings to be Tigger-ish, so I assume that's why I'm here. And there are kind of two reasons why I'm Tigger-ish. One is that I think that we're on the cusp of a revolution where what we're doing is combining technologies. in a way that makes them much more transformational. There's steps away from automating existing processes. If you look, for example, at the current fad for household-level solar panels. So yes, you've got better technology in the form of cheaper, more resilient solar panels, and that's great. You've also got Internet of Things technologies to monitor how they're working. You've got the mobile phone network. You've got mobile payments mechanisms to enable people to pay over time for their solar panel, and if they don't make their payments, it can be switched off remotely. You've got microcredit mechanisms, big data to figure out who can afford to pay, and you've even got now the ability to use the panels as a security for future loans for other kinds of financial transactions. And it's really that way of combining the different technologies that looks as if it could be transformational, because this isn't just doing the old things in a slightly better way, it's doing completely new things. Uber is a good example. We've been trying for decades to break the power of taxi drivers in some of the big cities of the world. But what Uber brings you is this combination of technologies that really leads to something transformational. So I think that the hypothesis there is that the change could be big enough that you that either the case for it becomes overwhelming, as in the case of Uber, or that the incumbents don't really notice that it's them that's being disrupted. These new technologies come in, as in the case of M-Pesa, and it's only afterwards that the banks realise that these payment mechanisms were there at their expense. The other reason for being tiggerish about the future is this idea that Richard Heeks, who's one of the academics who works in this area of digital development, talks about the digital development paradigm. So he talks about us moving from using digital to improve services, to increase efficiency, to using digital to change the relationships in the economy, the relationships between citizen and the state, between citizens, consumers and businesses, between businesses in the state, and that digital becomes a platform for a faster rate of change of those social connections that constitute the development process. So that's when you begin to see greater inclusion, greater voice in the political process. Social media is an obvious example of this. And you begin to see real changes in accountability. And we haven't seen much of that. And to the extent that we have seen it, it's been not universally positive. So we all thought the Arab Spring was a great step forward. Digital, Facebook and Twitter, well, that's really before Twitter, Facebook has empowered young activists to take on these authoritarian governments. Much of that didn't stand the test of time, and of course the same technology has then been used by ISIS, much more effectively in many ways, to do what the exact opposite of what many of us would have hoped. So this idea of digital as a platform, it can accelerate and amplify processes in society, but it's not universally necessarily all in a good direction. But it does. That is a reason to think that the future might look a bit different from the past. So where does that take us in terms of policy implications? I promised you 5. I'll go through them very quickly. The first is that I think in the weakest and most fragile states where public services are either non-existent or very poor, using digital to provide services that people otherwise wouldn't get, while more transformational, is a good thing. I don't think we should pretend that it's going to stop those states from being weak and conflict affected, but if you can get some people an education they wouldn't otherwise have had, or people access to a medicine they wouldn't otherwise have had, or financial services, that's a good thing. And so, while they're not huge transformation, I think in those contexts, the marginal gains from these improvements might be sufficiently worthwhile to continue with them. The second thing is that we should be thinking more about how we invest in platforms than in digitizing particular services. In 1983, when Korean Airlines 007 was shot down by the Soviets, one of Reagan's conclusions was that the global positioning system should be opened up to civilian as well as military use. And it took until 1995, it took $10 billion of investment to make a GPS system available, but Reagan took that decision, and in 1995 it was indeed open to the public as a public good, and of course that's had a huge impact on economics, public services, safety, as well as military applications over the years. And we underestimate the value of those kinds of platforms. So platforms like internet access, financial payments infrastructure, biometric and digital identity systems, public key cryptography to enable secrecy. Those platforms enable the delivery of these kinds of services, and those are good investments for public sector organisations, for governments to be making. Of 7.5 billion people in the world, about 4 billion don't have any internet access, about 2 billion don't have a mobile phone, and about 500 million are not covered by mobile phone reception. So it's interesting that only 500 million people are outside mobile phone reception. But we could be doing more just to give people basic access to those services as a platform. The third recommendation is creating an enabling environment for disruption. So for example, cross-border remittance payments, which we've all talked about over the years, has been extremely important. The obstacle here isn't that the technology doesn't work, the technology works fine. The obstacle here is ludicrous anti-money laundering legislation introduced by Western governments like ours that make it preposterously risky for any institution to supply cross-border remittance payments for moderate-sized payments. And the evidence on that is clear. You can produce all the technology you like, but however much you shave the margins, it isn't going to be worth anybody's while to provide that service in the developing world if they risk unlimited fines from the SEC. The enabling environment, domestic financial regulations for money payments, public procurement rules that enable the private. I mean, one reason why the private sector, MasterCard, for example, doesn't deliver cash transfers in humanitarian situations is that ECHO, the European humanitarian organisation, isn't allowed to contract to private sector organisations to provide services in the humanitarian context. So they couldn't employ MasterCard to do it if they wanted to. So public procurement rules are stopping the innovation that we could provide. So the fourth policy prescription, I think, is that we have to understand that these technologies need some regulation and governance. They're not unambiguously a good thing and just let them go. That doesn't mean we should stop them from happening, but it means we should have a sensible framework. The World Bank World Development Report last year talked about, if you have automation without skills, you get inequality. If you have scale without competition, you get monopoly. And if you have information without accountability, then you get control. So, for example, in the latter case, I think we're sleepwalking into some terribly badly designed identity management systems across the developing world, where we're giving both to companies and to governments way more power than they ought to have to control and manage identities. And we ought to be doing a much better job of putting in place a set of norms and standards and infrastructure that would enable there to be an infrastructure of identity management that still keeps privacy and empowers individuals to control their own data. We're just not putting those kinds of systems in place. And then lastly, international development cooperation, which hasn't featured much in what I've been talking about, needs to do more to take risks. I'm glad that Alex is going to be talking next, because what she does and her team does is a good example of this. Sadly, it's too rare. We should be better at embracing disruption. We need people on staff who know about tech. We have very few of those. They're far too risk averse. They work too little with the private sector, especially the local private sector. We should be investing in things like identity management in a box to enable governments to have these kinds of infrastructures with open source software that just work. We should be publishing open data for people to use. They're not doing. So we can do more in international cooperation to create an environment in which these things could happen. So those are my 5 policy conclusions. I said at the beginning that this was all a long version of Amara's law. Amara's law, for those of you who've been waiting patiently, is that we tend to overestimate the effect of a technology in the short run and to underestimate the effect of a technology in the long run.
Brilliant, thank you. That was an absolute model of what we're after. Lots of ideas. I mean, if we had 15 like that, we'd have our report done middle of next week. Thank you very much indeed. I've got some questions I need to come back on. Alex.
Thank you. Well, thanks a lot, Owen. In some ways, yes, you've made my job easier, and I hope that what we will both say will really complement each other. As part of the point that I'd like to make on behalf of the Global Innovation Fund, and I'll say a little bit more about what that is in just a second, is that part of the EOR story, thank you. Part of the EOR nature of the story that you've told has to do in part with how we fund innovation. And there's some potential for us, as I think the global innovation model suggests, to do things differently in terms of how we think about deploying ODA resources. The Commission has been clear that the commitment to 0.7% is something that you're very committed to, but as you said, we don't necessarily always need to do that the same old way. And the essential point that I'd like to make is that we need to use aid money, ODA, to fund and support the private sector and innovation in fragile places. But we need to do that in ways that can take risks and can engage with the local private sector in ways that have traditionally been very difficult to do from within the bilateral aid agencies. And frankly, from within very large foundations as well. I say that myself as a former member of the team at the Gates Foundation, for who you could say is equally challenged by this as those of us sitting in Washington or in London within the bilateral aid agencies. So let me talk a little bit about how we could think differently about how we support innovation and fund development technology in fragile places. So the Global Innovation Fund was launched by Mr. Cameron at the G8 in 2013 as a bilateral UK-US initiative. And I think at the time it was really articulated as a way of funding innovation and development and trying things out, a space to take experiments that's hard to do sometimes from sitting in DFID offices or USAID offices. And since then, GIF has grown to become a multilateral fund with additional support from Australia, Sweden, the Omidyar network. We're building new partnerships all the time. But we've also changed a little bit about how we articulate and think about what is the role that GIF plays in the larger financial ecosystem. And Professor Collier, I'm sure you remember, in Dublin used to address the Development Finance Forum and called for venture capital for fragile states. And I actually think that the Global Innovation Fund is the kind of money that we need for venture-style support in fragile areas. And I say that very deliberately, having told you already that yes, we invest aid money, and we make grant and debt and equity investments, and we don't have a target financial rate of return. I think all of those things are really important. Our colleagues from CDC and in the US, from OPIC and the other DFIs, do wonderful and important work. But the requirements that are placed on the DFIs often require private equity style rates of financial return, the deployment of large amounts of capital that drive them towards supporting infrastructure programs, which are important, but is not development technology, and often push them towards working in places with emerging middle classes. This means that we have a lack of DFI type money for fragile places, or it's difficult to deploy that money there. So there are other pools of capital that are searching for impact, social impact, but that also require risk-adjusted commercial rates of return, over relatively short time horizons. By definition, closed-end funds, which is what most impact investors are deploying, require exit and returns. And you know, they start off by saying 7 years, and maybe they get to 10 or 11 or 12 years, but those are not the kind of time horizons in which entrepreneurs in fragile places who are building the markets they want to sell into can deliver those kind of commercial returns to people. So again, impact investors who are doing really important, powerful work are not necessarily filling the kind of gap that we described when we were thinking about how are we going to support technology and innovation in fragile places. So I would put to you that actually the kind of money that we need to support development technology in fragile places and the private sector in these contexts needs to be patient capital that does not face the kind of drive for exit and return within the horizons that closed-end funds have. We need vehicles like GIF, which is a charity for tax efficiency purposes, but that's not the only mechanism you could use. You could use other evergreen structures, such as holding companies, for example, to do this kind of work. We need a risk tolerance that recognizes and is realistic about the kind of risk, especially related to currency risk, that we're going to be bearing. And then we need to be able to translate that into concessionary rates of financial return as well. That's why I think it is powerful that GIF is backed by ODA. We're taking what is generally quite risk-averse money, and by placing it in an external entity with an independent board, allowing it to take more risk than is generally possible from within bilateral agencies. But look, if we're going to do that, if we're going to be patient and we're going to take concessionary rates of financial return, then we really better be best in class about measuring the social value of the things that we invest in. And this means going beyond measurements like jobs created or lives touched, and being willing to be held accountable for, did you raise the welfare of poor people, not only of the emerging middle class, but of the poor or of the marginalized populations, and how can you report on that? You know, this goes to the value for money debate, but it's also just, frankly, you have to have a different decision-making rule if you're not just using a profit maximization rule or some financial hurdle rate that you're trying to achieve. And then we need to be entrepreneur-led, not strategy-driven, and be willing to, instead of taking the stance of, look, I have a think, and I think this relates to some of what Owen was just saying, you know, instead of sitting in your office in London or Seattle or Washington and saying to yourself, I have a theory of change about this sector and what is missing in it, and I'm going to go out and create investable opportunities to make that theory of change work, which I would call a strategy-driven approach. You need to follow the ideas of entrepreneurs and say, how can I support you to measure the social value of what you're doing and pivot your way to a sustainable, resilient service delivery model. I'll give two quick examples of a kind of thing, and then I'll wrap up, that I think that we can do. And these are both go to, I think, combining technology in new ways, as Owen said. We've recently taken an equity stake in a company called EM3 in India that is, I would call it Uber for tractors. And the essential realization that this entrepreneur had is that the need for tractors follows the course of the monsoon up Rajasthan. And normally, within this localized area, the demand for tractors is so concentrated that you can't really have a rental market. But what these guys do is make deals with tractor owners to bring their tractors up the state of Rajasthan and rent them out as the monsoon makes demand increase over time. And so here we're combining mobile technology, the Uber insight about idle capital can be deployed in interesting ways, and we're increasing the mechanization and productivity of the smallholder farmers at the same time. A second investment we've made, and this is a grant to help public sector innovation, is in the innovation called No Lean Season in Bangladesh, that recognizes that during the hungry season, there are ultra-poor people who are eating only 2 meals a day. but there are jobs in regional cities at the same time. There's arbitrage opportunities that people aren't taking advantage of. Our support helps microfinance institutions make small loans to those families to send an adult to the city to work on a seasonal basis only, and then send money home for their families. This makes a difference of going back to 3 meals a day from 2 for families that take it up based on randomized controlled trials. And that's politically controversial, maybe difficult to scale, but these are the kind of risks that we need to take if we are going to really drive for innovation in fragile places.
Thank you. Excellent. Really helpful. A little bit over 5 minutes. We're going to try to stick to 5 minutes if we can, so we get through everything. Mats is going to be next. Obviously, hopefully on the Tiggerish version. Mobile phone industry has done a huge amount to spread mobile banking and include people in the global economy, and also, as Owen said, elements of transparency and accountability as well. Mats.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Owen, I think you must have read my script beforehand. I've sort of rewritten it a couple of times here. So my name is Mats Granrud. I'm the Director General of GSMA, and GSMA is an association of all mobile operators globally. So we have roughly 800 members. Together, we connect 5.1 billion individuals. So it's an awesome reach and it's an awesome power. And with that comes an awesome responsibility as well. You can see the pin I have here, which is the 17 goals of the United Nations, the Sustainable Development Goals. And we compete on a daily basis, but one thing we can agree on, and that is that we connect everyone and everything to a better future. And I think there is no better narrative than the 17 goals than to describe what we in the mobile industry aspire to do. And maybe I should say a couple of words on the different technologies as well, because it will play a different role. In GSMA, we have been alive for 30 years. It started with GSM, 2G. 10 odd years later, 3G came along around 2000. It gave us better speeds. It gave us an introduction to data. 2G gave us mobility. 3G gave us a little bit more data. 4G gave us, well, better speeds, higher download speeds, lower latency, but it gave us something different. And it gave us what you said, Owen, the platform economy. It gave us the opportunity and the possibility to use the same technology globally. I could now, for the first time, call my friends in Japan, to call my friends in the US, not needing to switch different technology. We have the same technology, and that is fantastic. So I would argue that 4G changed my life. 5G now is around the corner. That's going to be launched in a couple of years' time. We're specifying and standardizing it as we speak. So what will 5G give us? Well, I believe it will change society, and that's why this commission is spot on. Now, 5G might not be sort of applicable immediately to fragile states, but it will have an impact on that. And why, I will come back again to what you said, Owen, on MCORP or mobile-enabled solar power. So within GSMA, we have something called Mobile for Development, a program that works with, a foundation works with aid money and try to initiate different projects, predominantly in Africa and South Asia. So I can give you a couple examples. One is disaster response. We have something called the Humanitarian Connectivity Charter, which we now have more than 147 mobile operators across 106 countries that have signed up to this charter, which basically means a code of conduct. When disaster strikes, do we know exactly how to handle that? Can we work together? And we have so many examples where we have not managed to do that. So that is one example. We have, of course, M-Pesa, which we take great pride in together with IFID to launch. We now have, in 10 short years, 500 million active users in East Africa predominantly, and it has truly changed the way people live their lives and also handle economic growth. Inclusion from a financial perspective. It's pretty dramatic. Mobile agri, smallholder farmers, 10 million of them or so we touch through our 2G connections, where we send them information on what crop to use, when to harvest, what pesticide to use, what type of price I can get for my produce, etc. And we can see tangible and concrete improvements in their livelihoods from that. We launched just 6 months ago something called Big Data for Social Good, where we're now trying to collect the information we have on the networks. And we're doing 5 trials in India, Brazil, Myanmar, Thailand, and Pakistan. India, Brazil, Bangladesh, Thailand, and Myanmar, those 5. Where we're now trying to collect information and see how we can do environmental pollution activities, TBC and smoking, to collect and anonymize data, but sort of aggregate data and information on top of each other. It's going to be really interesting to see how that project is going. And maybe I should say just a few words on M-Corp, or this mobile-enabled solar power, which I think is the most, I would say, the neatest and cleanest example of how mobile technology can help people that live off-grid. Today there is more than 1.2 billion people that live off-grid, that do not have any access to electricity. I went to Tanzania, to Dar es Salaam this summer, and jumped in the car and I drove out of Dar es Salaam. And after roughly 2 hours, the sun set, it was completely dark, went out to this little village, visited his family, a husband and wife, 3 kids, and the grandmother was there as well. It was pitch dark, except they had invested in this neat solution where you have a solar panel, you have a control unit, 4 light bulbs, a torch, and a radio. And what they do is exactly what you said, Owen. They have a small installment, they pay $10 initially, and then the whole system costs roughly $100. So they're in debt with $90. The man is a daily wager, so he goes out and does his daily wage. He gets reimbursed, or his wage is on mobile money, so he gets it electronically. He can then send this money, or part of it, to the company, called M-Corp in this case, where you would then do your installment. The company would then, through IoT, switch on the device, and he will then enjoy light for 4 days or 3 days, depending on how much money he will then send over the network. And you can see the difference in quality of life of this family. They can actually sit now under a normal light and study. They do not need to depend on hazardous kerosene lamps, which is dangerous and polluting the air, etc. They can actually live a normal life, and they have a torch as well when they go out to the bathroom. So that's a really neat way of combining those things. I will just end with 4 things where we're seeing that we are still having maybe 50% of the 5 billion people, or sorry, of the 7 billion people we are on the planet that does not have access to internet. It's access to internet that will make us an inclusive globe. So it's 3.5 billion people that have access to internet, which is 3G and 4G connections. Forget about 2G now, 3G and 4G. 3.5 billion does not have it. Now, so that's 50%. Out of those 3.5 billion, roughly 1 billion are lacking access, they don't live beneath a covered network. So it's roughly 15%. So the number one area to make sure that we have an inclusive globe is to build out networks, but that will only solve the 15%. Number 2 is skills. So I don't know how to use this thing. That's the second barrier of making sure that people are accessing internet. The third is affordability. Yeah, I know how it works, and I live beneath a coverage area, but I don't know how and I can't use it because of the money issue. And the fourth, the biggest issue, is that there is no or very little local content. I know how it works, I have enough money, and I live beneath a coverage area, but there's just nothing there for me. Similar to what you said, there's no point of doing it because I will not be listened to. It's the same type of social culture activity that we need to master. So there's 50% that does not have a coverage, but 35% does. So there is, building networks is one thing, but the biggest thing is this local content.
Thank you very much. Next, we're going to hear from Jamie. One has been an incredibly important organisation for driving the argument about debt, about trade, about poverty, about action on the development agenda, but has also always had an eye on this issue of fragile states and corrupt governments and lack of transparency and the rest of it. And so we're hoping you're going to give us some good pointers for where we need to go. Jamie.
Thank you, and thanks everyone. Fascinating conversation, and timely because we have opportunities to apply it imminently. So I should say briefly, one has primarily focused on doing development in poor but stable countries. But born out of work some of its founders were part of in the 80s and 90s, which was regretting when development had failed and being on the scene too late. And therefore we should try and focus our efforts on doing development, which is often harder to sell than humanitarian responses, because humanitarian responses are in the media, complex emergencies provide the attention that the TV demands, and so politicians feel obliged to respond to humanitarian emergencies, but not to do the boring, difficult long-term work of development. I say that because we must not, as we pay attention to the increasing fact that the poorest are in fragile states, forget about doing development well in poor but stable countries, because soon, if we don't, they will be fragile and conflict too. And indeed, some of the best solutions in fragile states will be to help their less fragile and more stable neighbors. You need those growth poles to succeed and prosper, to be engines for regional growth and employment and for people to move to. So, however, technology and its versatility applies obviously in those places too. So to the point, we should also say that there is absolutely no surrogate or replacement for time. Fragility takes time to solve. There's no quick fixes. And secondly, political will. There's no replacement for courage and coordination between people who don't like talking to each other. And again, technology can't solve that. We have to make those investments. As advocacy, by the way, also, we are an advocacy organisation, so we are not the brave frontline, people who are doing the first response work. And I wonder, looking around those who are here in the room, how many are. I think it'd be good to hear a bit more from them, particularly, and I'll come on to this, whether there's anyone from WFP who would like to respond to what Owen said earlier, because I've heard some other things which we'll come on to. Look, we see technology as particularly about how it can help the state and aid agencies deliver better. But because we're an advocacy organisation, we also put ourselves in the shoes of the people who are supposed to be receiving these services. How are they empowered to hold the system accountable for delivery? And technology and IT obviously applies to both sides of that. We all want to work in for a system where there's an enabling ecosystem where both the state and the aid agencies can supply and citizens can hold all of that accountable for delivery. And the biggest problem underlying all of this is data. We have a lack of it generally in development and particularly in fragile settings. In terms of what we can do in that area, there's an awful lot that's happened quite recently, particularly, and full disclosure, people close to me have invested in some of these companies, so Dharma is quite an interesting company that is based out of MSF's work, where it had to respond very rapidly to situations where health records were all paper-based, and by developing simpler surveys, public health first responders were able to put together much better data sets that then could be analysed to understand underlying trends in epidemics and how to respond in fragile settings. And that looks like in the fast-moving and necessarily frugal and difficult setting that they were working in, like they might have come across a platform that could be scaled up in many other settings. So that's Dharma, D-H-A-R-M-A. We are impressed, actually, owned by Scope and WFP's Scope card, and it seems to be a movement in the direction that you were saying they hadn't done enough of. I'm sure historically that's true, but there seems to be a recent move anyway by WFP to do a lot more cash and then digital cash transfer, and their intention is to scale that up rapidly. So your lobbying is working. But none of the development system is changing fast enough and does need to move quicker. In terms of other uses of technology to deliver services, I think the Vaki Foundation has done some very interesting work with providing satellites and solar technology at quite low cost, piloted for refugees in rural Ghana, and that's now being looking to scale it up quite quickly. But I don't want to talk so much about, for the same reasons Owen mentioned, about very specific things we should get behind and scale on the whole. It's about creating the ecosystems and the platforms by which a lot of things, and the norms and standards by which a lot of things might succeed, because very different things seem to work and fail in very different settings. In terms of holding citizens accountable, which is where I sort of tend to feel a little more on safer ground, helping citizens hold the state accountable. Ushidi's now a decade old and still embarrassingly one of the best examples, though they haven't necessarily helped sort out Kenya recently. The One Award winner, the recent winner of the One Award, is a group called Connected Development. And it's something I'd like to talk about quite a lot and would encourage the Commission to look at very closely. It's a group of young people in Nigeria who use mobile phones. However, they spend quite a lot of money on SMS, and maybe you could help there, Matt. They are doing what you could call youth ground truthing. So they go to the clinics, the classrooms in Borno and northeast Nigeria, and they check to see whether the money from WFP or UNHCR or FAO or DFID has actually got through. And they are what their hard work and bravery and commitment to their community keeps revealing is that the aid world, despite lots of commitments in Busan and elsewhere to aid transparency, is still very poor at giving up information to local civic-minded activists who are trying to find out what's actually going on, and putting together the databases you'll see from UNOCHA with what seems to be turning up on the ground. And we need to do far more as an international community to get behind groups like CODE in Nigeria and scale them up. There are plenty of other examples of CODE-type organizations across the continent. There's worries about taking any one of them and scaling them because they are so locally specific. But if we could figure out together what the platforms are that share best practice, that provide low SMS costs, provide maybe free mobile phones, so that we can connect them to, and also get the commitments from all the aid agencies working in these difficult environments to open data, they could then verify whether things are actually turning up on the ground. And that independent third-party verification that they could supply could also be, by the way, a form of employment for the young people in these areas that everyone is so worried about. And it gets them on the track of actually having a thing to do for which they get payment that is actually filling in the gaps in data and filling in the feedback loop gaps that development suffers from so much in these settings. And we're excited about this organisation and its potential to scale, but also want to connect it with many others that are trying to do similar work. We're very keen on working with you all on applying all of this to Macron's work with the G5 on the Sahel Alliance. Obviously, the President of France has a lot on his plate, but no president of France can ignore the large Francophone growing population just south of them, and for which they have a lot of responsibilities and opportunities as that population grows and Europe's population gets senile. We will have to work on Eurafrique or Afropia or whatever will be called by 2050. The Sahel Alliance could be an important way by which a politician, more of that generation, helps figure out a better partnership. What we're working on with them is an application of transparency and accountability through the Open Government Partnership, with Burkina Faso being an anchor partner of the G5 countries, and a series of commitments as part of the Open Government Partnership to open data, the Open Data Charter, public registers for the beneficial ownership of companies, open budgets and open contracting, all the good stuff of the transparency and accountability community and what they ask for. So all the countries would have to commit to that. Investments into political governance, so non-executive branch oversight of expenditure and the media, and then this third tranche of investing in youth ground truth schemes across that region. All of this extremely hard to do, but hopefully with enough political will and a sense of urgency, we can, as an international community, get behind applying some of these ideas and using technology to turbocharge transparency as we've long wanted it to in that sort of setting. I've got some very specific examples of Code Nigeria's work which I could share.
That would be very helpful.
Afterwards.
I think we probably need to draw a close. I was going to ask you what exactly the name of that thing is called. Code Nigeria.
Connected Development, so it's a it's an acronym.
That'd be really useful if you could let us have the details. Thank you. That was excellent. Osman Hanif, we're going to hear from next. Milvik Mobile, Pakistan. Tell us all about it.
Great. So thank you for having me here. I'm going to jump right in because, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm going to jump right in because I recognize 5 minutes, not a lot of time, so I'll try to be quite quick. I'm going to start by talking about the work that Milvik does across the world, and then I'm going to sort of briefly touch upon some of the experiences or some of the issues or challenges we've faced that perhaps the Commission would be relevant to the Commission, sort of their work later on. But that's sort of the basic structure I'm going to keep. So Milvik started about 7 years ago in Ghana, actually, and it's now and basically the vision of the organization is to provide or use mobile technology to provide insurance and health services to the low-income consumer in emerging markets. And I mean, I think the basic idea is traditionally these consumers don't have access to insurance services through traditional channels. And why is that? Well, there's several reasons for that. One is there's the distribution costs have traditionally been very high, as have been the sort of the premium collection costs. In addition to that, I mean, most consumers have no idea of insurance. So 99% of our insurance recipients in Pakistan, for Milvik Pakistan, are first-time insurance buyers. So you have this sort of, a big challenge where traditional providers aren't really offering any coverage to these people who desperately need it, who are, I mean, you look at the population of Pakistan, 60% or less than $2 a day, financially very vulnerable. So how does Milvik sort of approach this or overcome this challenge? Effectively, we've merged a technology platform that allows customers to register for our product on their mobile phone. For as little as sort of 2 cents a day, they're able to get sort of some premium collected. And that offers them sort of coverage of up to $2,000 in terms of personal accident insurance, which for many of these people is enough to cover them for 2 years in terms of income. So that's part of it. But we've also found that it's not just enough, as Owen said, to just develop sort of the technology and sort of bring it out there. That helps with registrations. But the big sort of challenge we really have is also educating the customer. And oftentimes, we focus a lot on the technology, but we don't really focus on how it is that someone is actually going to adopt this and use this. And that's where we have a very sort of large agent force that is actually there to educate the customer, sign them up, and let them sort of use it. So, through the past 7 years, now Milvik's operating in 14 different markets, and we've sold close to 30 million policies, over 30 million policies. In Pakistan, we've been operating for about 2 years, and I have over 1 million policies with sort of a Jazz telco provider. So, I mean, that's and it's not that we were the first people to try and do micro insurance. Micro insurance was around for 20 years before that. There were small-scale projects. Everyone was trying to do it. It's actually the sort of marriage of sort of technology, or new technology, or mobile technology, really, with sort of agent force, and sort of we recognize this need that's really allowed us to scale up. But I mean, I think those are sort of broadly sort of Milvik's success story, and sort of Milvik Pakistan's. But I want to come to a few issues or points or raise a few topics that I think we can discuss perhaps later on. One, I think, is actually sort of this idea that I think we actually need to sort of promote and I'll talk about 3 different levels. I'll talk about sort of promoting some limited level of brain drain for short periods of time, which is sort of a funny way of saying it, but I'll talk about why I think that is. Talking a little bit about sort of the realities, or addressing sort of the realities, or the media addressing some of the realities of what some of the markets in which we operate are actually like. because I feel like we're not often seeing a holistic approach or a holistic view of the markets in which we operate. It's often, you know, one-word snippets that really, I think, increase the perception of risk in a lot of these markets, which leads, you know, to sort of further detriment later on. So those are the, sort of the two, I think, topics that I'd just like to briefly touch upon before my 5 minutes are up. When I say limited brain drain, I mean, if you look at a lot of the sort of leading figures in sort of the tech scene, in sort of the innovation scene in Pakistan, they usually have been either, usually locals who've been abroad on sort of educational training of some sort of exposure abroad. That could be, you know, a self-selecting sample of people who have certain resources, but even people who have come from sort of slightly less sort of economically well-off backgrounds, the idea that they're actually getting exposure to this world where new technologies are sort of, you know, available everywhere, and exposure to these ideas allows them often to come back to the country and actually introduce those ideas to the local market. And as in this current environment where countries around the world are sort of closing their borders, I think it's very important and critical that we try to maintain those open and maintain those that exchange sort of open as well. And then finally, I mean, the idea of the holistic approach, I mean, it's, you know, obviously coming from Pakistan, perhaps this is very sort of, I feel more strongly about it than most, but you know, you're more likely to die in a gun violence attack in the US than you are, you know, from a terrorist attack in Pakistan. And so, and obviously these countries are obviously very large. So it's important to, I think, recognize or sort of, and it's not obviously the Commission's role, and the governments in some sense are responsible as well. But there is an important sort of duty and responsibility I think we have to try and present a more holistic and nuanced view of the different countries in the world.
Very fair point. Next we're going to hear from Nirmarom, founder of two successful companies in the energy tech, dev tech space, which you can tell us about. Welcome.
Hi, Steve.
Hi.
I was asked to talk about the developments in the solar space, and specifically on things that Owen and Matt's touched upon. So thank you for setting up the stage, even if you didn't know you were setting up the stage. I'm the co-founder of Lumos. Lumos does off-grid distributed energy, solar energy, mostly in Nigeria, all parts of Nigeria, Ivory Coast now, and the Philippines soon to happen. Thank you. So, you know, the problem is power, getting electricity to the 1.3 billion. You guys mentioned it, and this problem is a huge one, you know. Generation assets, distribution, billing, all of this is expensive, and it's even more problematic to do in places which are the developing world. So with that in mind, that's the reason why 1.3 billion people don't have access to electricity. And I would say that many of the things that we all want to achieve start by having power. You can't have health if you don't have power. You can't have learning if you don't have power. And you can't have productivity if you don't have power. And that's where, you know, distributed solar makes a lot of sense. And I'm sorry, I do have 2 or 3 slides to help make the point. So what is distributed solar? It's a solar panel, and it's an indoor unit. Put the solar panel onto your roof, put the indoor unit in the home, and you get electricity. The indoor unit is a big battery and some electronics to help manage everything. Now, a system like ours, and our system is relatively large when comparing to solar home systems. A system like ours in the market will cost $600, $700, $800. $600 to $800 is not something that my customers can afford. So the basic problem is affordability, and the way we solved this problem and some others in our industry, and this is becoming an industry, and I think that's good news for myself and for my competitors. We solved it by, instead of people having to buy the generation asset in the same way that we don't buy a big power plant here in the Western world, you pay for the electricity. And that's a technological advancement. It's a way of billing through your mobile phone. We can do it on mobile money. We do it also on airtime billing integration, if that's interesting for you. But, you know, pay small installments through your mobile phone, and we lock, or actually the system is locked, and we open it up when you pay. So instead of having to pay $700, you pay 50 cents a day, which is the same budget or sometimes even less than you had been paying on kerosene, candles, flashlights, or on diesel generators that were harmful and noisy and kill people with their fumes. So this is the basic system, and affordability is the technological leap gets us to affordability. And Owen, you said technology doesn't get us there, and I fully agree. I think technology is a start, but you have to build the ecosystem for scalability. It starts with the technology, but you need to have the distribution, especially with physical assets. Osman touched about this with agents having to touch the people, and there it's still not a physical asset. We need to deploy physical assets. So you need the distribution, you need the sales, you need the marketing, you need the customer support. Building this is very, very expensive and time-consuming. And the way we solved it at Lumos is by using existing infrastructure, working with mobile operators out there. So in Nigeria, we work with MTN, the largest mobile operator in Nigeria. They have 60 million subscribers. They believe we can put 10 million systems of Lumos systems out there in Nigeria. They do the distribution for us. They do the marketing for us. If you go today to Nigeria, you will hear commercials in the radio and on TV about Lumos mobile electricity, and then that's driven by MTN. They do first-tier customer support through their existing call center, so 5,000 or 6,000 call center people can answer phone calls on Lumos. And if you can move to the next slide, next slide. This is Nigeria, and the next slide, and this is the Lumos deployments. Most of these deployments were achieved in the last 12 to 18 months. We're touching on the lives of 500,000 people today. 90 million people don't have access to electricity, and we're providing, we provide electricity now to roughly 500,000 people. Small businesses and homes. And Matt, you may not be aware of this, but the GSMA helped fund the first 500 systems. Back then, it took us a year to do 500 systems. We are doing 500 to 600 systems a day today. If you can jump to the next slide. So, homes. Yes, not all of them rural homes like you see in the bottom left. Some of them middle class. And to your point, Alex, some of these technologies just fit more than just, and this helps get, the fact that it fits the emerging middle class helps us get to the rural, because it helps, when the son who's emerging middle class learns about the system, he gets the system to travel 200 or 300 kilometers away from the shop to his mother in the village. In the map that you saw previously, we don't have stores, or MTN doesn't have stores in all of the far north and every one of these areas. Nevertheless, the systems travel because someone used it in his peri-urban home and then moved or bought a similar system for his mother. Schools and clinics, we have quite a few of them. I know of one hospital that's actually on the grid, but the grid doesn't give them the power that they need, and they're using 3 of our systems to power 20 rooms. Small businesses, and talk about economic growth, opening up businesses for 2 or 3 more hours every day. When they used the generator, the cost wasn't cost effective. The cost of the generator was more than the revenues that were coming in. I just met a few months ago a guy who's using our system to sell cell phone charging for his neighbors. He's charging 50, 60 phones a day. He used to do it based on his generator. I'll talk to you in dollar terms. He was making $200 a month in revenues from charging cell phones. He was paying for the generator $150, so he was netting $50 a month. He moved to our system. He's now paying $15 a month, so he's netting $185. Almost everything that he's making, he's netting. So small businesses, this chicken coop is the one I love, because I previously did large on-grid solar projects like 1, 2, 3 megawatts, and many of them were on huge commercial chicken coops. I love this picture. So scalability, it's not enough to have technology, you need to have the business structures, and these are the regular business structures that you needed every business. Talking about weird ideas or great ideas which don't have the way to touch the people will not work. 500 systems a day brings me to the next problem. The next problem, of course, is financing. The demand is endless for us, for our systems, really, really endless, for our systems and for similar systems in other places. The problem is financing. Small amounts of financing are there. You know, we got the GSMA grant, which was huge in helping us learn that there's a market and develop and stuff. The problem is now shifting to the medium cap financing. In the next 12 months, we will deploy $250 million of assets in mostly people that this commission is talking about. Finding the financing organizations, and for example, OPIC provided us with $50 million of debt for Nigeria, which is great, but we need now 250. Finding the organizations and finding the ones who are willing to believe that after you've deployed 100 systems, you're eligible to do 10,000. After you deploy 10,000, you can be financed for $1 million. That's the problem, and that's where, very similarly to what you talked about, Alex, organizations need to help us leapfrog the trust issues and the belief. We can deploy 10 times more systems every day that we're deploying today like this, had we had them available. That's it.
Thank you. Really helpful, because obviously one of the issues we've been looking at is how to encourage private sector development, the importance of infrastructure, the difficulties often with fragile states of dealing with governments and infrastructure and high levels of corruption, and here's a way where you can sort of leapfrog and provide an enormous amount of infrastructure without actually necessarily going through those systems. It's a very interesting question why you can't get money out of development banks and other multilateral institutions. Exactly the sort of thing our report should be looking at. So absolutely fantastic. Thank you. Right, now we're going to hear from Josie Norton, co-founder of Help Refugees, and you're going to talk to us for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you.
And then we've got 2 more after that, and then we're going to go to questions and points and discussion. There are 1 or 2 things that have come up there. People are disagreeing. We need to bring out the arguments. Over to you, Josie.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. So I run and founded an organisation called Help Refugees. We started in August 2015 in response to the refugee crisis as it hit Europe. 1 million people arrived on the shores of Europe that year. And we were a group of people who initially actually only aimed to raise £1,000 and 1 van load of items that people would need, tents, shoes, that kind of thing. But 2 years on, we work in 10 countries. We've raised and spent £9 million and reached 600,000 people. And the reason that we've had to do that is because what we have found throughout Europe, and we now work in the Middle East, is that the system that was providing both emergency response and long-term solutions to these people was in some way broken. And so I'm going to kind of tell you a little bit about what we do and the recommendations I would have to try and help make that system not be as broken. So we arrived in Calais in France. We used social media to raise these funds. So instead of raising £1,000 in 1 week, we were able to raise £56,000 in 1 week. And again, that use of technology is hope that this is an example of it being something positive. The public really want to help, and they want that transparency of where their money is going. And we were able to show them exactly where it was going through the use of social media. We arrived in Calais in France and expected to find the governmental body or the INGO that was there taking care of the people that were living there. And there was no one there. There was 5,000 people living in a field, babies with no nappies, people had no shoes on. If anyone had somewhere to sleep at all, it was some really rubbish little tent with holes in. It was about to be winter. There was no wash facilities. People didn't even have drinking water. It was, you know, it was shocking. So we ended up partnering with a local French association, and that's something that's, again, very much part of our model. Everywhere we've gone, we partner with local organizations, and we ended up setting up a warehouse, a distribution system, a shelter building program, a hot food kitchen, community kitchens, a women and children center, a youth center, and basically became camp management in the absence of there being another body to do that role. We tried to listen to the needs of the refugees and then advocate on their behalf, because although we're in France, which is not a fragile state, the state that these refugees were living in was fragile because they were essentially stateless. and try and take the kind of the conversation of what was happening on the ground to what we were when we were meeting politicians or when we were meeting people that ran huge INGOs. They didn't really know about the reality of what was going on the ground, and I think that conversation between the ground and the high level across all of this sector is something that needs to be really, really improved. So we also, the other thing that we encountered in Calais in France was the issue of unaccompanied children. We at one time were looking after 1,000 unaccompanied children, the youngest of whom was 8. And again, that there was no system in place to protect those children, and we were trying to get funding even just to shelter and clothe, make sure that these children had a mobile phone and credit, because that often saves children's lives. But the restrictions on people's funding meant that no one could fund and help these children in that situation, because it can only help them if you can meet a certain set of criteria, and we weren't necessarily able to do that. Actually, amazing organizations like Vodafone have funded us and helped us in our work. So we started to advocate for those unaccompanied children, work with the public, again, using social media. The public was able to tell politicians that this was an issue that they cared about, and now over 1,500 children have been given safe homes through different legal routes that we were able to open through working in France. At the same time, we started to work on the islands in Greece, so at that time when people were still arriving, people were drowning in the sea, people were arriving on the shores of Greece with hypothermia, there were shipwrecks, they had no food, they had no shelter, they were unable to register. Again, it was a humanitarian crisis, although we were in Europe. There were funds that were put aside by various different countries in Europe for these very vulnerable people, but I can tell you as a person that was standing on the shore of those islands that that money had not got there. And so once again, it was grassroots sector that stepped forward and was helping people. But again, so we were crowdfunding money, which really taxpayers had already paid for in money that had gone to the European Union to then help these people. It's not the reasons that we discovered why that money hadn't reached them is a mixture of politics, but it was also the bureaucracy and the restrictions around funds. So the context of this situation changes so quickly, but it takes a year to get a fund approved by all the different sections that it needs to. And of course, M&E and everything is super, super important, but something needs to change about how flexible and how quickly funds can be approved and where they can be directed. Again, with regards M&E, so we started to work on the islands, and then the context changed, the EU-Turkey deal happened. Rather than being a situation of people on the move, it became people trapped inside countries, but because they're stateless, they had no access to different facilities. But often it's a numbers game, and people aren't thinking about the dignity of the people that they're helping, the humanity, the respect, the hope. And I think it's important to have indicators like that when you're working out how effective grants that you're making are. Transparency and the sort of, everyone always talks about return on investment, but we have core costs of 4%, and I hope that within the next couple of years we will be at a stage where we can have a group of private investors and corporations pay our core costs so that the rest of all the funds raised go directly on the ground. And obviously that is something that I think a lot of the public are worried about with when donating money, either to INGOs or with their tax money, where that's being released, and making sure that money is being used as effectively as possible, employing locals, again, supporting the host community and the host economy, employing refugees for us is also very important, and we try and be very transparent about all the funds that have been used. Technology, again, another thing that's we found is really important is that this has been a crisis of information. A lot of people just don't have access to knowing what's available for them, and so we've been working actually with Google on a service directory for refugees that would be completely open source. So refugees, either on the move or in the new country that they're in, are able to upload, this is the place that you can go and get help with getting a job, this is the place that you can go and get help with where you get food, whatever. But working with technology that those refugees are actually going to use, because there's a lot of apps and things that get talked about and that aren't necessarily beneficial. Then also, I think it's important to say that the way we fund is gap filling, and there are huge gaps being left, and the only way that we're able to understand those gaps is by having direct information from on the ground and having that updated regularly. So talking about cash, for example, cash is one of the most important ways of getting aid to the people we work with. But again, sometimes the restrictions that have been placed on different organizations mean that there's gaps of 1 or 2 months for people getting that, and we are filling that gap. Or families that are a family of 5, say, if the children are all under 3, then the mother might need to be buying nappies, and if she can't breastfeed, she's also got to buy infant formula, and she doesn't have enough money because it's just been decided in an office somewhere far away that this is how much money that a family deserves, and that kind of real local knowledge isn't necessarily being found. I think I'm probably at 5
Thank you.
minutes
No, excellent. Thank you very much. Well, some common themes there about direct payments and coming through from lots of people. Next, we're going to hear from Hassan from the Bill & Melinda Gates Foundation, Middle East branch.
Thank you very much. Do I need a microphone?
I'll put it quite close to you.
Thank you very much, and it's an honour to be here, and it's a great pleasure to be amongst a lot of friends and an alum and grantees and partners, and you, David, because I want to just start by echoing what you said about 0.7%, because I think amongst many, I'm sure, triumphs past and still to come, I think that will be one that it goes down in history. And I hope that you don't have the honour for too long of being able to say it's the only country, because you should be joined by others. But
they haven't got there yet.
Macron's promised by 2024.
Well, promising is one thing, doing is another.
Including refugee costs.
Yeah.
Well, for 1 year, yes.
Yeah. That's very true, but we'll give David the credit of not being just on a technicality, but actually sending that money abroad. But so I'm a Deputy Director of Global Policy and Advocacy at the Gates Foundation, and my particular responsibility is for the Middle East, North Africa, and more recently Afghanistan and Pakistan. And so in an organization that focuses very much, as Jamie was talking about, on poor but not fragile environments. My job is a lot about, okay, how do we think about those contexts which are more fragile, working with a range of teams at the foundation, from our emergency relief team, polio team, vaccine development team, and others. So I'm going to try and reflect what they might say if we were all here together, and I hope that they forgive me if I don't. One of the things that I was reflecting on as this fantastic group of people were talking is that there are many different roles that need to be played, and I think it's important that they're all there. And you probably can't optimize for everything at the same time. And our North Star is impact. Impact per dollar, what's the most impact we can reach with our money. And doing that means you're not going to optimize for some other things. And so we're always trying to optimize for very high leverage things. And that is the reason, not for any other, that we normally go to poor but more stable environments, because the opportunity for impact is so much higher. And so when we think about, so there's a couple of ways, though, that we think we can have a great impact in fragile environments, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit. You're hearing from one of the most technological evangelist organizations that there are, and so I hope it powerfully echoes some of what others have said when you hear from us to say technology is not going to be, certainly not on its own, going to be the answer to these issues. There's a law that I wanted to mention, and I just thought of it while Owen was talking, so I can't tell you what the law is, but I'll try and get you that name. But the law says that in a system where, in an improving system, maybe one of you knows in an improving system, the link in the chain that's improving least quickly and very soon dominates the entire system. Owen's going to come up with the name of that law. And so if there are important things that are not improving and we're optimizing around the technology piece, we'll find that very soon the problem hasn't gone away. We've just optimized for a diminishing return. There are, and then another thing about the aid system with regards to technology is we may not be the right people to be investing in technology. Now, the Gates Foundation invests with regards to aid organizations a lot in technology, but it's actually a tiny amount to invest in technology compared to what the private sector invests in technology. And so we have to be very thoughtful about using our money for high impact and not trying to replicate what telecom companies are doing with their trillions of dollars. However, sometimes, so this is kind of point number one, is sometimes there are really transformative global goods that we should be investing in, and wherever possible, we should be going after those global goods that are going to affect fragile environments. And I'll give the example here of the Coalition for Epidemics Preparedness Innovations, CEPI, which is all about health security, pandemic security, and saying, can we pool funds to get the best possible research to rapidly find vaccines for some of the things like Ebola, which threaten to destroy the progress that may be made in fragile communities, as we saw in West Africa recently. So yes, there may be times where you can actually just invest in transformative global goods, and by and large, that'll be the biggest piece of that particular problem. But I think and there's two other things that I'd like to talk about. And in both of those cases, technology is important, but actually our role is about thinking, what is the peculiarity about the fragile environments, and how can we overcome them? Because the technology in many cases will exist, and I was reflecting as Mir was talking that actually solar panels, and it's important that you've got the price down, or that the price has come down, and trillions have been invested in that. But actually, the reason that you've been successful is because you've come up with a pricing scheme. It's not technology as such that is the reason you've reached 500,000 people in Nigeria. So I think our job is to think about how can we identify the right technologies, but how can we provide the enabling environment for them to succeed? And so I'll talk about two examples. One of them is getting to the last mile in infectious diseases. And when we look globally and try to fix problems where there's a high and sustainable impact, eradicating diseases is top of the list. And so, but you're going to have to eradicate them everywhere. And guess what? The fragile environments are going to be where they're last redoubts. And so in polio, where we're near the end of the disease, and at some point malaria, which is now in many countries, but eventually is going to be just in one or two, it's those fragile environments that we're working in. And technology is a lot of the solution here. There's genetic tracing of every single polio case so that we know how it's related, who are its cousins amongst the other polio cases we've had, and you can start seeing how the disease is moving. There is a mobile payment systems to pay vaccinators. In Pakistan, I believe, if not the biggest employer, one of the top 2 or 3 biggest employers in Pakistan is the polio program. So hundreds of thousands of quite low-paid people across the country needing to be paid for their services. Mobile payments, a way of actually getting them that money relatively effectively. So these technologies are important. And another one that's been really helpful is, well, in these areas, you don't know where people live. You don't have a good census data. So where are the houses that people should be vaccinated? Well, you can use satellite imagery. But the biggest problem has not been whether or not we have the technology. It's the enabling environment around it. So when it comes to Pakistan, for example, it hasn't been possible to use satellite data because it's highly politicized, and the polio program needs to be nothing to do with any other programs that might be trying to work out where people are moving and living for obvious reasons, and so that data hasn't been available to the polio program. The politicization of the conflict has meant that, along with other issues, polio has been sucked in, and when people from countries that have active engagements of other kinds in that country are the ones calling for polio to be eradicated, then there's a limit to the impact that you can have. So for us, really, I think some of the most transformative power of being on the edge now of eradicating the disease is depoliticize the issue. And the way that we try to depoliticize the issue is in many ways. As the Gates Foundation, we try and maintain our own very independent voice. So we're not coming to you as the government of this country or that country. We have no other interest than reaching the kids. And trying, therefore, to find ways to make sure that delivery is happening across lines, whether it's in Syria, where there's people on one side of the conflict that may be highly unpalatable and difficult for any country to talk to. Can we make sure that polio vaccinations are still getting there? The second one is around gathering religious leaders. The third one is around finding great partners, like other donors like the UAE, who can lead the charge. The third area. So the first was the investing in global goods. The second was chasing disease to the last mile. The third is how can we make sure that technology that is coming out of some of the slow and, as Jamie said, boring work of development, reaching the situations of humanitarian need where things are moving so fast, as Josie well said, that actually you can't innovate while you're working so fast. And there's two in particular that I just want to call out, and I know that there's not a lot of time. So the first one is around sanitation. Here again, we've got fantastic technology that can allow toilets to not only be sanitary, but also to produce fuel and power and water. But the business model that can allow people to work in the sanitation industry through the use of these technologies is, I think, really transformative. And then the final one is on digital financial inclusion, which has been talked about a little bit. But I'll just finish by saying, here again, the technology itself is just one piece of the problem. And the political enabling environment to allow that technology to succeed is the biggest challenge we face. And so that's definitely a policy recommendation. So policy recommendations: invest in genuine global goods where possible. Think about what needs to go around the technology to remove the barriers. There's definitely a lot of policy around digital financial inclusion that needs to be looked at. And finally, I think in order to get the political barriers removed, politicians need to raise development issues when they're in these conflicts. It's not just about the warfare, it's not just about arms sales and other things. Development needs to be raised at the highest political level, because otherwise these technologies won't do very much.
Thank you. Excellent. Very, very helpful. Last but not least, Janet Southern, COO at Spring Accelerator.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Really interesting conversations, and actually quite a few things that are resonating with the work that Spring does on the ground. Spring is a 5-year accelerator, a program that's primarily funded by DFID, but also USAID, DFAT, and Nike Foundation. And we work specifically with small-scale startups, growth stage, and in some cases mature businesses to develop services and products, so create service and product innovations, but specifically for adolescent girls. Now, adolescent girls aren't necessarily the only market, could be looking at the broader consumers, but really trying to look at adolescent girls as an underserved market and how important they are. And the way we do that is through service and product design innovation, but the backbone of our support is really around human-centered design. And I want to talk a little bit about that in the context of this discussion, because I think that we've been having some great discussions, but the thing I think that's been lingering on the surface but hasn't really come to the forefront is a really important variable that links to social norms and the local context that some of us have been talking about. Josie and also Alex was talking about entrepreneur-led initiatives. Human-centered design methodology, really looking at designing for people, for the users, for the consumers, for beneficiaries, and actually how if you don't design things that people actually need and actually work in their environments, it doesn't matter what you do on the broader scheme of things. It doesn't matter if you have a broader enabling environment, if you have access to finance, if you have all of those things which are important and we do need to facilitate. But if you have the wrong innovations, the wrong products and services, you're not going to make a difference on the ground, and actually it will be all for naught. So it's really important to look at that as a key factor, as part of that bigger piece, to really make it holistic, bringing on what Osman said. It's really important that we actually look at things within that lens. I think another area that I would just briefly talk about is creativity. And again, it links to the social norms, it links to local context. I think if we can ground our innovations and our approach to implementing technology in fragile environments, we need to be looking at local cultural traditions and how they can actually support technology within their specific context. We can't be, as we have in development more broadly and historically, created matchbox thoughts that are sort of a cut and copy and paste in environments outside of Western thought, because actually it's strategy-led. It's not going to be appropriate. And so actually being able to say, will a cultural tradition grounded and mixed in and blended with a technology innovation, is that going to work better? So an example is a business that we're working with called Goats for Water. And they're actually using the traditional method of bartering, in this case, goats for water, the technological innovation being a solar paneled pump, and actually pulling that together to create a commercial sustainability for the business, but also creating social impact for people on the ground so that you can increase their access to that particular service, to water, and create a holistic solution. So for me, I think those 2 points are really important. Incorporating social norms and really making sure that we're looking at those, creativity, and I think those things can really help us be agile and be flexible to the work that is done in these areas and these environments. As I think Jamie was talking about, these are long-term pathways and long-term horizons, and again, Alex was saying the same thing. But within those long-term horizons, we need to actually be flexible and adaptive, because needs and demands are going to change, and it's not going to be something linear. So we have to be able to flex and adapt to those. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. That's really helpful evidence you've all given. Thank you again for coming. We've got 25 minutes or so for questions. I'm going to abuse the chair's position by kicking off with a few, but I know my co-chairs will want to join in. Can I start with you, Owen? You made a very good point about platforms and about making data public, because that can be hugely helpful in development, but also in improving the quality of government. You mentioned GPS. Are there other particular platforms you had in mind where you thought either international platforms like that then have an enormous effect, or do you mean actually more like individual governments having plans for putting, whether it's maps or crime statistics or hospital figures or what have you, all as public data platforms because they help with development?
So there isn't that much global data. There's some that we already share, like meteorological data. We already have a good system for meteorological data to be shared, which benefits from that. There's some coming up like genome data. Where clearly you don't want that protected by private commercial interests, because that's a platform on which you could imagine there being lots of innovation in the future. Part of this is national and international in things like commercial confidentiality. We don't have a clear understanding yet of which, particularly for public procurement contracts, which and how much of those contracts should be kept private and which of those should be public. So, for example, if
governments around the world were publishing details of their procurement contracts. That's information that other governments could use to improve their contracting, to figure out what pricing is sensible, to figure out if they're being gouged by a particular supplier, but also would enable other suppliers to compete for those contracts because they could see who's winning them on a more basis and what you need to do to get a contract and so on. And the tricky part there is figuring out the balance between protecting the legitimate commercial interests of companies that are bidding on contracts with the public interest in having that information available. So there's an example where the world as a whole could move forward. We as rich countries could be publishing more of our data, and that would be helpful to the rest of the world, but we just don't do it.
From your view, is there any organisation promoting this agenda internationally? Does the World Bank say anything about it? It seems to me, it is actually, I found in government the publication of data sets led to massive business creation apart from anything else, but there doesn't seem to be an organisation that champions it.
And a good example in this country, of course, was the Ordnance Survey data,
classic,
where that's a platform for huge amounts of information. And global mapping data would be, and satellite imagery data would be another great example where, the more of that that's out there. There are a small number of
fits our theme of resilience, because that is how you might help make countries more resilient.
Right, and you could imagine, for example, agricultural land use data that you can get from satellite data being incredibly useful for tackling resilience and so on. So there's lots of these things that could be public. But part of the problem is that lots of governments are paralysed by a worry about not really knowing where they should draw a boundary between public information and legitimate commercial confidential interests. And we just don't really have a very good analysis of that.
That's really helpful. I've got a question, it's sort of for you and Alex, really, which is, in fact, anyone else can join in on this, which is a lot of you said we need to put more aid money into risk, into tech. These things should be more entrepreneur-led rather than some strategy dreamt up in a government office somewhere. I suppose my question is I want you to be a bit more specific about how exactly. I mean, the Global Innovation Fund was set up with specifically that purpose, but would you, from your experience, would you say that other DFIs, organisations like Commonwealth Development Corporation or others, that they should change the way they work, and if so, how exactly?
I'll make a couple of points, and I'm sure Owen can jump in on this, and I'll draw a comparison not just to DFIs like CDC, but other ways we fund innovation like challenge funds, right? DFID has a ton of challenge funds and puts a lot of money into that as a way of funding innovation. And what that often is quite passive. You have a competition, people get an award, and then you're on your own a bit. Yeah. And maybe there's follow-on funding after $100,000 for $1 million, but then again, there's a cliff and you drop off. That's quite different from the way a venture capitalist would support innovation, and I think this is an important thing to reflect on. And the first is being willing to do sort of tiered funding. Take small amounts of money, very high risk. As you prove things out, more money follows you through its really series, seed, Series A, Series B. We really follow you along your path. So that's one. And then number two is active venture support. Venture capitalists spend a lot of their time being the partner of CEOs and founders while they figure out what they're doing. And a lot of the way that in aid we've traditionally funded innovation has not been able to deal with that. And those are a very different set of skills. And also it costs money. If you really want to drive down overhead rates and call that value for money, then you're going to push people to being more passive as investors and coming in at later stage because, it costs the same amount of money to spend $200,000 as it does to spend $2 million or $20 million. So we have to be willing to pay the kind of money that it takes to give that early stage seed funding, support the entrepreneur, and have ideas about how we're following them through.
Yeah, please. Yeah, thanks. Well, I was going to ask you, actually, is it time now that you should be getting money from, the AIIB or the African Development Bank or, surely you're on that scale, aren't you?
We are, and we're talking to everyone, and without sounding, without pushing back on people who are actually helping us, I would say that I really relate to the VC model, and I think that part of the problems with the DFIs is that you're not used to working with a growth business. You're not, you have great programs for individual steps, but for me to learn how the World Bank finances this and how it's too big of a problem. And I think there's a lot to be learned from the general VC and private equity industries and on how governments helped facilitate that. So for example, it's a well-known story about the Israeli government launching the VC industry in Israel back in the 90s, which launched the whole technological industry in Israel. Had these funds gone as first loss mechanisms in private-public partnerships, VCs dedicated at impact. How many of these are there, and how many, a very small amount of money can lead to bring in private capital and make this a regular, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. The VC world is there and doing a lot of good in the, internet and regular places. We can do the same in impact. Let's learn from how they did it.
Okay. Yes, and then I'm going to bring in Paul.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think just to pick up on what you were saying, both of you were saying, I think the challenge is also being able to create that holistic support. So yes, grant funding, and yes, the VC, venture capitalists might be doing it well, but for entrepreneurs on the ground, they actually need support around investment readiness. So one of the things that Spring does is provide not only a certain amount of financial support, which is disproportionately, it's proportionally benefit, but we also provide them with investment readiness support. They need to be able to know how to approach an investor and say, this is my portfolio, this is the different areas of what I'm trying to achieve here through my product or my service or my business overall. And so that can't be achieved through just providing capital, and they can't be, okay, here's some seed capital, go off and now raise everything else, because there are two elements to that. They need to be able to have the knowledge to actually go out and raise that capital themselves.
Okay. Paul, you want to dive in with a question?
Yeah, one or two things. We're very much, as a Commission, onto the problem of venture capital funding in fragile states. I should just
yeah, we've had it from everyone.
Yeah. I just wanted to come back to the solar panels question for a bit, which was great, absolutely great. But I've got one very simple question, which is, what's the cost per kilowatt hour?
It's a question I get asked often, and I think I'm going to avoid it and then come back to it. I'm going to avoid it because that's not a fair comparison. You need to compare not to the cost of the grid, which is not there and will never be, but rather to the cost of alternatives. So if you go to a Nigerian kind of state where that needs to, thank you, that needs to charge his cell phone, and he goes to a central charging location and pays 10 or 15 cents for 4 watts of electricity, he's paying $200 per kilowatt hour. So
I buy all that, but what I'm trying to get a sense of, obviously the fact that you're scaling up so fast to demands drive, you're filling a need. That's just great, there's no question about that.
And saving people money.
Yeah, absolutely, it's great. So don't get me wrong, but in my mind, the question is, what are sensible alternatives in different locations? Now, looking for your map, you're selling this stuff in Lagos at the moment. Right?
We're selling this everywhere.
Yeah, but I mean,
but yes.
But the fact is that the sensible solution for Lagos is provide a bloody grid. Right? Now, there's another class of sort of solar entrepreneurs who are not doing solar, they're doing wind, but they're trying to do local area grids.
Mini grids.
Mini grids, yeah. And so I'm trying to get a sense of where is it sensible to go mini grid, where is it sensible to go grid, where is it sensible to go...
I think the market will decide eventually, but you're completely right that in theory Lagos could be served by the grid. The truth of the matter is that the entire Nigeria has 4 or 5 gigawatts of capacity for 90 million people on the grid. And I don't know, you know, this is probably enough for 2 million people, not for 90 million people. So
I've
the
been
grid,
to Lagos twice this year so far. I'm very much attuned to.
But the answer will be a combination. There will be grids. There will be mini grids. The problem with mini grids is, in my perspective, and I came as an entrepreneur, I come from the on-grid world. I decided not to go to mini grids. I think mini grids suffer from the worst of both, not the best of both.
That may well be.
It takes years to plan. And eventually you're with a solution which is not better than the solution we're provided, but it takes 2 years to build a mini grid for 500 people, whereas we do it every day. So, but eventually there will be mini grids, there will be grids, there will be very small picocell solutions. There will be a combination.
Yeah,
Can I want to adjudicate the Jamie versus Owen argument on the World Food Programme and these cash payments, because we've heard a lot of evidence of people saying that actually direct cash transfers that DFID are doing more of. We had a meeting in Bangladesh. You know, it's been very positive response on how effective this is as a anti-poverty programme. What's the... Are WFP standing in the way, or are they not? I was a bit confused.
Not only them, but do you want me to...
Well, I mean, I think I agree with everything you're saying. I'm just saying I think they have heard the argument and are starting to change somewhat. So the question is whether they are...
Right. Will you indulge me with a 2-minute anecdote about this? Because, I mean...
Yes, we're trying to finish by 3 o'clock, so you have to shorten it. Give us the
WFP are doing cash transfers, and they certainly want to be the UN agency that captures cash transfers as a business for them. And there are many people in WFP who see cash transfers as a huge way forward. And a big part of their constraint is the constraint put on them by donors, particularly Congress, that wants to see the WFP concentrating on food delivery, preferably surplus US food production. So these are good people trying to do what they can within a constrained system, by and large. About a quarter of WFP support is currently provided by what they call cash, but that turns out to be partly what we would call cash, which is you can spend it on what you want, and partly we're going to give you a card or a voucher that you can use to exchange for food somewhere. And of the quarter that they call cash, only a quarter of that is cash.
Yeah.
So it's 1/8 of total WFP support. This is the leading UN agency in this space, is cash in the sense of giving people real choice and agency about what they buy and where they buy it from. Now, DFID and ECHO last year tried to persuade in Lebanon a group of UN agencies. It was WFP, UNHCR, UNICEF, and 6 NGOs called the Lebanon Cash Consortium, have a single payment card that they all top up that can be used for these different purposes. And DFID and ECHO said, wouldn't it be good if we had a single needs assessment, not food by WFP and UNICEF doing blankets and someone else doing it, but a single needs assessment, a single cash payment to the household that they can use how they want, and a single assessment of what happened to that. And this consortium of UN agencies and NGOs said, absolutely not. We will not let you, we will not bid, if you put that out for tender, we will not bid for it. And indeed, they put it out for tender and did not bid for it, because we each need to have money flowing through our systems to justify our continued existence in the Lebanon. So instead of moving to a simplified, user-focused, empowering system where people could choose how they wanted to do it, all these UN agencies insisted that all the money had to flow through their budgets onto this single cash card. The single cash card is progress, but what you're seeing is people trying to make sure that their continued institutional existence takes precedence over the needs of the beneficiaries.
Got it. That's really helpful, because part of our thing is fragile states obviously suffer from often shocks, and the issue of their resilience is a key thing to how to improve the outcomes, and that actually is directly relevant. I just want to bring in Tim, because you probably have some questions.
I'll focus on one issue which hasn't been discussed much, which is the issue of coordinating strategies. I mean, the one thing that's very striking about Nia's example is how little you have to coordinate with other kinds of organization. You can deliver your, I mean, the absence of a grid is a classic example. Once you don't have a grid, the need for coordination is limited. But most of Owen's initial examples of the next generation are all about things that require a huge amount of intensive cooperation across different forms of technology. So, and actually, as a member of the current National Infrastructure Commission in the UK, we're grappling with this issue. In fact, we're about to come out with a report on new technologies and their role in infrastructure provision. And what's overwhelming, even in a country like the UK, which wasn't fragile last time I checked, is being able to do these things in a remotely coordinated fashion. So I guess I don't know if anyone has anything to add on that. Of course, the platform here is the internet and is that core that we have. But I find myself somewhat skeptical of a future in many of the countries we're talking about where you can have that degree of coordination across technology strategies that seem to be implied by what you thought would be the big new generation of possibilities.
I'm sure others will have something to say, but let me say one quick thing. Standards, right? You don't need, coordination isn't necessarily what you need to get technologies to interoperate. Standards are what you need, and we have the GSMA here, so let them.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think that absolutely so. That's how we managed to get 4G to be the global platform. And I also think that the degree of coordination is pretty big. Take the solar example. I mean, without the cooperation with MTN, without having a mobile network, that solution will not work. So there is certainly a high degree of cooperation, of coordination, even in a solar environment. So platform standard is absolutely critical.
Hassan, you want to come in?
Thanks, Jez. Just very quickly. So, I mean, I think you've heard a couple of different perspectives. Well, I didn't represent the let's have a strategy perspective, but that's implicit in my organization, and one that says, well, you shouldn't all have a strategy. And I think the answer is that, well, certainly you can't optimize for overly coordinating and letting 1,000 flowers bloom. So we have to be clear about, you know, to what extent is that even a strategy and coordination the right thing. I think one of the things that's powerful in terms of coordination, and we were talking earlier about how do you finance this stuff, is by thinking through what are the different pots of money out there and how much risk are they willing to take. Because we could always try and convince DFID to take more risk, but they're responsible to the British public and they probably won't change. But, you know, are there pots of money that are super high risk, the DFID, which is a grant but is still responsible to the public, and then other things which are loan but they're concessional, and other things which are really seeking high returns? And can you coordinate the financing chain from high to low risk in order to get some of these problems solved? But you probably do want to let some flowers bloom as well, so we can't over-coordinate.
Okay, other questions and points? I had a couple more. So my question for you is about how are you going to be able to access bigger, interesting test case when you come up against trying to expand, and will the classic development banks and other financial institutions back you? You think your answer is probably yes?
Yes, I'm sure my answer is yes. And to be very clear about the point I was making before, I think on the debt side, the DFIs are great. They're providing, you know, subsidized debt, or if not subsidized, it's willing to take more risk. So on the debt side, and for us as infrastructure, we do equity and debt. So on the debt side, they're great. On the equity side, I think the other models work better. We're in long-term negotiations and talks with all of them, and I hope, knock on wood, that it will be okay.
Jamie, I just want to come back on something you said on the open government partnership. How much applicability do you think that's got to the most fragile states? Do you think there is a genuine opportunity to get them in and get them to commit to various things?
I wouldn't say it's easy, no. But Burkina Faso is in and is looking to play some kind of coordinating role within the G5. So with regard to what I said with the Sahel Alliance, they want to be a hub for open government in that region. There's a pushback on the OGP in Africa that's real happening at the moment. Great tragedy happening in Tanzania in that regard, which had been blazing a trail on OGP, and Magufuli is not a fan. I think we might have to work with partners on the continent, at least in the African case, to find a way for OGP to feel more African. Without it meaning it's not, you know, what it needs to be. The examples I gave are also applying to what France should do as much as what the G5 should do. or what the G7 or the European Union should do. And the European Anti-Money Laundering Directive has not yet passed. So there are parts to this puzzle which are not just about what the fragile states have to do, but what we have to do, as you well know, and championed in 2013 at the G7, and that kind of work and that agenda is still going on.
Well, we're getting short of time, so is anyone who hasn't spoken who's itching to either ask a question or make a final point? Sir.
I guess I'll be a little bit of a gatecrasher since I'm not part of the original panel. But so I'm Seth Kaplan. I'm from Washington. I'm at Johns Hopkins. I wrote the concept chapter for the forthcoming UN World Bank report on prevention, and I worked with the bank on redefining fragility and so on and so forth. I would say, observing this conversation, I would say, one, there's a presumption that development decreases fragility, and one of the core themes of the UN World Bank report is how development can be destabilizing. And,
it's really going to cheer us up.
I think that we need to separate what is fragility and what is development and not conflate the two, because they are very different. And if you think of fragility as something to do with social fragmentation and a lack of any autonomous rule system or set of institutions to manage group-based conflict, which is sort of the main, I would say the first rule of thumb for any political order is you need some sort of legitimate political institution to manage that conflict. And you think how technology has increased fragmentation, especially in the weakest fragile states, because it increases grievances and it increases the ability to mobilize at a subnational level. I would really like to see a greater emphasis on how technology can better measure group-based grievances and how that leads to mobilization, polarization, and if you want to make any change or any development not lead ultimately to some sort of violent conflict, we need to be much earlier in the process, and technology offers great scope to early on manage group-based, how groups operate within society. And I think there should have been a larger emphasis on this build-up in terms of how it leads to conflict, and also countering negative narratives. Because what's happening in all over the world, actually, but most notably in fragile states, is these groups are now developing different narratives. There used to be unifying narratives. Now you have dividing narratives. And we need to be better at understanding those narratives and then countering those narratives somehow. And I would say those are two things I would have liked more of an emphasis on.
That's really helpful. We did have earlier sessions on the causes of state fragility, the causes of conflict, and of course the question of, well, how could you prevent states from getting fragile in the first place, and how could you prevent conflicts from breaking out? And I think your point about how technology might have a use there is really helpful. We've always tried to have our meetings begin and end on time, so we're going to end at 3. I want to thank everyone for really useful evidence and thoughts. If you have any other thoughts, particularly on this key question of how, through your experience, technology can either help either help states be less fragile, help governments be more capable, help states be more legitimate, help recover from conflict, be more resilient. Any thoughts on that would be, incredibly useful. And I suppose something I was itching to ask all of you was, in the work you've been doing in fragile states, what have you found most difficult? Whether it is installing solar panels or trying to chase down the last few people with polio, or helping with refugees. Where have you bumped up against authority and found it most difficult to deliver the change that you're trying to do? That would be very helpful. So any extra answers on a postcard, as it were, on email would be very helpful. With that, meeting closed. Thank you very much.